Millions of people want them, just as many people are terrified of them. We're talking about car exports from China, and specifically electric vehicles with connected vehicle capabilities. This is a big issue, and today we're going to be talking about how U.S. allies are approaching what is effectively a big trade issue with China. My name is Ilaria Mazzocco. I am Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Let's look at some data and understand the issue better. This chart, we've looked at it before. It's the exports in terms of numbers of vehicles from China to the rest of the world. So you see in January 2020, and prior to that, of course, China was not a major exporter. Now, fast forward to December 2025, and you can see how quickly that number has grown. If you were to look at it from a value perspective, the trend would be fairly similar, although the breakdown between electric vehicles and internal combustion engine vehicles would look slightly different. But the trend is the same, right? That the number of EV exports is actually growing relative to the total, and the total number of exports is also growing. We'll see how that develops in the course of 2026, but this is what the data looks like through 2025. And it really explains why this has become a central trade issue and a really hot topic in many countries. And the big issue here, as I said, right, it's not just internal combustion engine vehicles, which of course, those exports are also being driven by an internal market dynamic in China where Chinese consumers are increasingly shifting towards electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engine vehicles. Now it's about 50% of sales. But also there's this sort of dramatic technological shift globally that's being driven in part by this increase in exports from China. This issue has been in the news again recently, thanks to Prime Minister Mark Carney of Canada's visit to China. During that visit, a trade deal of some kind was announced. As part of that deal, there was an agreement that China would be able to export up to about 50,000 electric vehicles to Canada at a reduced tariff of 6%. Now, the current tariff is 100%, and that has a bit of history as well. Now, that was announced in the fourth quarter of 2024. As you can see here, this data is in quarters, as you can see. And it really sort of led to a collapse in exports from China to Canada. That tariff, of course, was followed the tariff that the Biden administration introduced of 100% on electric vehicles from China for the United States as well. So Canada at the time was following very closely U.S. policy on China. If you were to add up, roughly speaking, the numbers of sales in the previous 2 years, it sort of adds up to about 50,000 vehicles. So that is what Mark Carney has said is the current deal would sort of resume that same trade as before. Now, what is interesting is a lot of these cars that were being exported from China to Canada were actually Teslas. There were a few others, right, like Volvos, for example, which are is a Chinese-owned brand. But there were a lot of Teslas, which is, of course, a U.S. headquartered company, which has a huge factory in China. So that was certainly the fact at the time. Now, the composition of exports from China is actually skewed a lot more towards Chinese brands, such as BYD. And in the announcement, Prime Minister Carney really sort of highlighted that that Canada was interested in acquiring more, lower cost vehicles that would sort of reduce the average price for Canadian consumers that are interested in acquiring electric vehicles. That would suggest they're probably not thinking of Teslas, which are, come with a slightly higher price tag. So it'll be interesting to see exactly what vehicles end up coming into Canada as a part of this deal. It'll also be interesting to see if this deal actually sort of holds. There's been actually some criticism from the United States. Initially, President Trump said that he had no issue with this deal, and later he threatened Canada with very high tariffs. And of course, the USMCA, the trade deal between Canada, the United States and Mexico that replaced NAFTA, is being renegotiated as we speak, and will certainly, I think, be looking at the automotive sector, which is such a big employer and such a big part of the economy for the United States as well as other parts of the world. And now moving to a different part of the world, where electric vehicles have been a very big trade topic and a source of dispute between the European Union and China, we see that why this has been the case. Now, the European Union is a very different position from Canada. It used to actually be a big exporter of cars to China. Now, this data here is data collected from the Chinese customs, right? So it's looking at it from the Chinese perspective. And you can see how China had a big trade deficit in the automotive sector with Europe. So this looked pretty good from a European perspective, right? It meant that Europe was exporting quite a lot of cars, a lot of value-added, advanced technology from a certain perspective, right, to China. This changed. You can see how this changed quite significantly. And then, now it looks like China actually in 2025 has finally sort of achieved a surplus vis-a-vis Europe. This is quite concerning to the European Union. This is also coming at a time when there's been a lot of concern about competitiveness in general, manufacturing. And I cannot stress enough that this isn't really a story just about cars. And cars themselves are a pretty big industry, as I just said. This is a story also about technology, right? We're not talking about just a chunk of metal that's being transported. We're talking about a chunk of metal with advanced batteries in it, which comes with its own entire value chain, which has other applications, including military applications, and also software technology, right? There's connectivity, there's autonomous driving. It's the future, in many cases, of a whole ecosystem and software. So who is actually investing and producing and manufacturing and part of that value chain actually really matters for innovation more broadly. Now, let's look a little bit at how this shift in the balance of trade happened, right? Because as we mentioned before, there's quite a bit of internal combustion engine vehicle exports from China as well as electric vehicles. But you can see that electric vehicles are really what's the big driver here, right? Look at, again, this is the imports, right, into China. So it's exports from the European Union to China, very low, remain very low. And then exports from China to European Union have really grown quite rapidly in terms of electric vehicles. Now, if we were to look at internal combustion engine vehicles, what's remarkable is that, yes, they have declined, right? You can see how there's been this decline, especially in the last year or two, of exports from the European Union to China, right? Those are the imports into China. But there still are some exports, right? And there's been a little bit of an uptick in exports from China to European Union, but it's certainly not comparable to what has happened here in terms of electric vehicles. So you can see that electric vehicles are really what's sort of tipping the scale here. Of course, again, I can't stress enough that in China, fewer and fewer people are buying internal combustion engine vehicles. The Chinese market is not growing at a huge pace. In fact, it hasn't really grown that much over the past few years. There's actually been, quite a bit of stagnation in recent years. It is growing a little bit now, but what really has changed is that those consumers have now shifted to electric vehicles. So that's really tough news for European manufacturers that used to export a lot of gasoline-powered cars or diesel cars to China. And that makes it, very hard in the future to sort of rethink what the commercial relationship between the European Union and China will be. Now, Europe has also been in the news because there has been this long-standing dispute that led to tariffs on Chinese-made vehicles imported into the European Union. That tariff depends on the brand, right? It varies significantly, 7% about for Tesla, much, much higher for companies like SAIC, almost 40%. And that's on top of the current tariffs in the European Union. So that's been a big issue between the European Union and China. There's been a lot of debates, and there seems to have been maybe some sort of opening to some sort of resolution in the recent weeks. We'll see what that actually turns out to be. But again, it does seem to be that there's definitely going to continue to be exports from China to the European Union. Those tariffs that were introduced by the European Union have never been as high as those of the United States or Canada, and not high enough, certainly, to block that trade, and that was never, I think, the explicit intention. Now, the other thing to note is the United States has other obstacles for Chinese manufacturers looking to enter the U.S. market, and particularly the connected vehicle rule that the Biden administration introduced and is still standing under this administration really makes it very, very difficult for any connected vehicle manufacturer that is based in China to export to the United States. The European Union recently announced the Commission announced a draft, a proposed cybersecurity law, which would have implications for manufacturers, but we're, I think, still a long ways from seeing any sort of ban of that kind. Now, I think, just worth noting, why would somebody like Mark Carney be even interested in Chinese EVs? Why are they so popular? Now, this is data by Professor Helveston at George Washington University, and he published it recently in a Science article, which I would encourage people to take a look at. But I think, what's really remarkable here in the data he collected on prices of electric vehicles, and he was just looking at pure electric vehicles, battery electric vehicles, not plug-in hybrids, is that you can see that the red is Chinese vehicles. So you can see that generally speaking, they tend to be cheaper, right? This is the price range here, but also perform better on the whole in terms of batteries, right? If you take or on par with the cars that are sold in the United States. So you can see how there's that performance and price package, which is highly attractive. With SUVs, you can see that the performance is probably, about the same, but the price is much lower. Now, there is a big debate, right? Are these prices due to subsidization? Are they due to more efficient production lines? Is it scale? What is it, right? It's probably a combination of all these factors, right? It's really hard to disentangle them. But if you're a consumer, honestly, you don't care if it's subsidies or not, right? And so that really explains why around the world, in a lot of countries, these have had incredible success. And it's really been governments that have been trying to figure out, is this good for my economy? Is this not good for my economy? In many cases, it's really a mix, right? And also there's been a lot of debate of, well, can those Chinese manufacturers come make that car here? And that is actually a debate that a lot of Western countries are also having. This is a very open debate in Europe, and there's been a bit of competition actually in Europe to try and attract more Chinese manufacturing in Europe and sort of figure out how to get more value added, more technology transfer. Again, Mark Carney sort of hinted quite openly, actually, I would say, not hinted, that the objective of letting in some exports from China of electric vehicles was to also get more investment in Canada. And there are debates in the United States of whether or not the US itself should be more open to Chinese investment in what is sort of a technology where China has really performed really strongly. And I think if you look especially at the battery value chain, has really strong leadership and innovation. And I think that's really very hard to see a pathway for that right now due to regulatory and political opposition to it. But President Trump himself keeps hinting that he might be open to it. So I think, again, I wouldn't put my bets on this happening, but it's certainly going to continue to be a big debate, and a debate that we'll be following here at the Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics at CSIS. Thank you so much for following this show, and stay tuned for more.